Hey, well, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here, talking about the new Tim Burton long-awaited sequel, Beetlejuice, Beetlejuice. I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So since its release way back in 1988, when I was just a wee little baby wearing a diaper, Tim Burton's Beetlejuice, the original film, has gone on to become somewhat of like a cult classic. But with Hollywood's rush, recently to reboot, remake, retool, really any existing property with any even marginable fan base, it should be the surprise of no one that this long-awaited sequel is arriving in theaters 36 years after the original film. And I'll say right from the start that this was not a film that I was excited for. I'm not a Tim Burton guy necessarily, as we'll get into in this review, but I'm surprised that I enjoyed this more than I expected it to. I think there is enough sort of earnestness and heart in Beetlejuice to disarm any like cynics that are just quick to dismiss this as just another example of corporate Hollywood's cash grab and capitalizing on nostalgia and older properties. Although I think this is a film that not without narrative issues and I think some content for Christians to prayerfully consider. The film does have sort of a magnetic energy that many of Hollywood's other sort of recent reboots have just seemed to have lacked. For Christian viewers not repelled by the spooky aesthetics or spiritual overtones, I think Tim Burton's captivating, inventive visuals and effectively dark humor does provide enough diverting entertainment value to justify this sequel. But before going any further in this review, we do need to first address the giant poltergeist in the room, and that is that this film very enthusiastically just plays around in the sandbox of spiritual subjects and like a Halloween-esque visuals. And I know just from experience reviewing a lot of these types of movies that films like this can prove to be very divisive for Christians, with some just very deeply disturbed by what they deem to be like, satanic promotion of real world occult. And you have others, on the other hand, who see it merely as like a playfully spooky aesthetic in a very like imaginative work of fiction. I think for any of you in like the former camp, this movie is not going to be for you. And again, you probably already knew that just from the marketing material alone. But personally, I fall into the latter category of those Christians. Yes, there are definitely spiritual elements. You have ghosts, you have the afterlife, but I just don't sense any like real, true spiritual darkness beneath the surface of the creepy prosthetics and dark atmospheres. Nor do I think that like Tim Burton himself believes that like, the film's depiction of spiritual matters and the afterlife in any way reflects reality. I think instead it is a very like fantastical work of fiction that is born out of his, famous macabre storytelling sensibilities. And so I'm not here to, try and raise any kind of outrage or satanic panic towards this film, and neither do I, desire to try and convince any of you Christians that are uncomfortable with a film like this to loosen up and just go see the film anyways. I think instead this review, my intention is merely to kind of approach the film for what it is and kind of explore it for those that do choose to go see it. So with that said, let's dive in. So Tim Burton is probably about as singular of a director as there is working in Hollywood today. I think his unique kind of stylistic approach makes it very easy and like quick to discern whenever you see it. Like, yep, that is definitely a Tim Burton movie. I think despite recognizing his talents as a visual storyteller, like I said, I've just never been drawn to sort of that brand of films. Although the fact that I did find a lot of charm and some amusement in Beetlejuice owes much to Tim Burton's touch. And it's just evident in this film kind of all throughout that, everyone in front of the camera, everyone behind the camera is just having an absolute blast making this film. And probably no one more so than Tim Burton himself. Although I will also give a shout out to William Dafoe, who really just delightfully hams it up in a supporting role. And much of sort of the film's contagious energy does come from just sort of the torrent of wacky visuals and, that weaves together just a ton of interesting creature designs and fun prosthetics. And there's also just a lot of interesting like stylistic shifts all throughout this film as the movie like suddenly turns into an almost like stop motion-esque animated style, or one sequence that becomes all black and white with a foreign language voiceover, or even the third act that suddenly kind of explodes into a very elaborate musical number. This film is just constantly throwing fresh ideas at viewers, and I think while some of those ideas work more effectively than other ones do, it's never boring or lacking in imagination. And despite some very great acting performances, I think Michael Keaton kind of seamlessly reprises his iconic role. And there are some emotional story beats in this as well. I think for the most part, the narrative does lack behind the quality of the visuals, because this plot is somehow both like overly complicated and just remarkably simple. It attempts to juggle like, an abundance of characters and storylines, and occasionally it does just get bogged down in this convoluted exposition as it attempts to, get viewers up to speed of all the events that have, taken place since the 1988 film. And there are plot threads that are like introduced and then just neglected for a long period of time, to the point that like when the story's like main villain shows up for the climax of this film, my first thought was just, oh yeah, I totally forgot about her. At the same time, I do think this story seems to be merely an excuse just to bring together these bizarre, wacky characters and crack some funny jokes and showcase the visuals. And I think Beetlejuice is perhaps approached as some sort of like entertainment stew, where it's just best if audiences don't strain too much thought about, the individual ingredients, but where I think the weaker elements of this, like some of the plot, is more satisfying when just consumed as a whole. And tonally, this movie is very much a dark comedy. It's not so much scary as it is like intentionally unsettling or disturbing, although its attempts to like evoke disgust in viewers is typically done in like a very comedic manner. And such humor obviously is just not going to be to the taste of all viewers, particularly some of its more like extreme like gross out gags, where such you have a character like literally spilling his guts, or like a repeated vision event where a woman sees herself giving birth to a monstrous child that looks like a baby Beetlejuice. Although not all the humor is paired with disgust, because there are plenty of just genuinely clever and like funny jokes that do emerge like naturally from the characters and rarely feel forced, such as like William Dafoe's brilliant character, or kind of the escapades of Beetlejuice's shrunken head minions. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, when it comes to language, there is some language in this movie. There's one like clearly heard verbalized F-bomb, as well as two others, like one that is bleeped out, and then one where the character is like cut off before she can finish articulating the word. Then there's just sort of a handful of other like more minor profanities, mostly beginning with the letter S, and the names of God and Jesus are both used at least once. As far as violence, there's not so much a whole lot of violence as much as it is like kind of grisly, images, because the majority of the violence in this is either like implied or it's done to non-human characters, because the ghosts in the afterlife in this film, they carry like the means of their death into the afterlife, which does result in kind of a range of either like humorous or more grisly images, like a surfer who missing his bottom half from a shark attack, or a man that still sort of has piranha fish chewing on his skin in the afterlife from drowning in the Amazon. And probably the most disturbing of the visuals is there is a man that kind of walks around and he's missing the like, upper torso and head. So he's, it's just all sort of this bloody cavity there and a little bit of blood splurting out. And another woman who had been chopped up in a previous life, and she has to sort of put her body back together, almost like a mannequin, and like staple herself together. And again, the visuals themselves aren't like realistic. They are more like cartoonish, but again, they are quite unsettling. And with sexuality, the only thing that comes to mind here is that there's like a flashback, a montage where a character like narrates his honeymoon, and he describes like the carnal lust and passion that they were experiencing on their wedding night, as you see the characters kind of like forcefully, almost violently rolling back and forth in the bed, although they are both entirely clothed for it. And the scene is depicted in like a comedic manner rather than anything sensual. As far as themes, worldview, things going on beneath the surface of this, probably the main thing is just sort of the way that it explores the reality of the afterlife. Because as one character declares early on in this film, the afterlife is so random. And at least that seems to be the case in the afterlife that Tim Burton imagines in this film. And at least to me, I found one of the more intriguing elements, like the world building elements in the Beetlejuice movies, is how they sort of juxtapose the film's version of a very, dreary, mundane afterlife with the more like loftier view of heaven and eternity that comes from like the Bible and a Christian worldview. And that contrast is made very explicit in one scene in which a priest that is at a funeral is like waxing very eloquently about the glorious experience that the deceased man is now entered into, which is very starkly different from what the audiences already know in the film to be true. Although it should be noted that kind of the afterlife on screen in Beetlejuice is arguably closer to sort of some kind of view of purgatory rather than being heaven itself, because there are places like the great beyond or damnation, which are revealed to be like separate locations that the dead can eventually journey to. And years ago, during an interview, director Tim Burton said, "I remember being forced to go to Sunday school for a number of years, even though my parents were not religious. No one was really religious. It was just the framework. There was no passion for it. no passion for anything, just a quiet, kind of floaty, kind of semi-oppressive blank palette that you're living in. I think in many ways, sort of the afterlife depicted in this film does reflect kind of Burton's childhood experience, because the afterlife in Beetlejuice is not a place of passion, not a place of joy, but merely just sort of a prolonged, dreary existence where people continue on with the mundane tasks and work that they experienced during their life. And that grim understanding does also result in sort of this insignificance of death, because, again, some of the indifference for the characters is just due to the film's comedic tone, but character deaths in this film are almost greeted with just a shrug. If death is merely like a mundane continuation of life, then really neither life or death carries much significance. And as Christians, we can contrast that very unsatisfying view with John's heavenly vision described in the biblical book of Revelation, where although we do mourn the dead, we also celebrate that they have entered into just a beautiful eternity in heaven with a loving God. I'll also say too that if maybe that earlier quote from Burton may lead you to assume he's just a very hardened atheist, but again, he repeatedly explores spirituality in his films, including obviously in Beetlejuice. I think kind of initially the most like atheistic character in this movie is Astrid, who is played by Jenna Ortega, who is the daughter of Winona Ryder's character from the original movie, and she repeatedly rejects like the spirituality of her family and very confidently declares that she doesn't believe in anything that she can't see and touch, and that she chooses to follow science rather than just superstition. And of course, as would be expected, her very materialist worldview quickly crumbles as she is pulled into the spiritual reality, and her eyes are open to the fact that there's a lot more that going on in this world than we can see or touch ourselves. So I think like the framework of that spirituality in this film is obviously very inconsistent with biblical truth. I think the wider theme of faith and belief in these spiritualities can be affirmed by Christians. So in the end, Tim Burton has had 36 years to let his imagination run wild, and it does show in this film. I think Beetlejuice is a rare sequel that feels like it still has plenty of new ideas to bring to the table. I think it's a movie that doesn't attempt to do a whole lot much else beyond just having fun with its classic characters and entertaining viewers for what is a relatively brisk hour and 45-minute runtime. And I do think that it mostly succeeds in that aim. I think the spiritual elements and just the dark humor will likely keep many Christians away. And hey, that's okay. I don't think this is a must-see film by any means. But I think for fans of the original or just viewers who enjoy some dark comedy and, inventive, bizarre visuals, I think Burton does demonstrate in this that he's still got plenty of juice left. But hey, I would love to hear what you think. If you check this out, if you love the original, or hey, you're going into this, you haven't seen the first movie, don't be shy. Jump into the comment sections, be respectful, but let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't done so too, encourage you guys, subscribe to our channel, become a Collider, got lots of other movie reviews, got our faith and pop culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching, stay safe, and continue to collide with the world for Christ.